Record. Welcome to the fourth of a series of interviews I'm conducting with Tony Hurle as Tony retires after 28 years of ministry here at St Paul's in St Albans. My name is Peter Crumpler. I'm a member of the ministry team at St Paul's and have known Tony for almost all of those years. So it's a great joy to be conducting these interviews. And we come today to 1992, the year when Tony and Lydia and John and Ruth came to us at St Paul's. So just a reminder of what else was happening in 1992, just to set some context. It was a time of recession in our country. It was the year that Windsor Castle caught fire. It was the year of the Olympics in Barcelona. Bill Clinton was elected as President of the United States, and John Major, against all odds it seems, won the election against Neil Kinnock. It was a long time before social media, before the web was in widespread use. The most popular film of that year was Aladdin, the animation film by Walt Disney, and the most popular song of that year was Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You, from the film The Bodyguard. So that put some sort of context into what was happening in 1992. But for you, Tony, you were coming to St Paul's. What was your first impression of the church as you came to it?
Well, I said last interview about how we got here was through this lovely lady in Barking whose relative, Irene Fowler, lived in St Albans. And we were going to Oxford for some reason, so we came by and looked at the church. And as I saw it, I thought there's nothing so heavy as a load full of potential, a sort of Peanuts line, cartoon line. So I think the potential of the church is massive. And we felt that. And we'd just gone to New Wine in the August, and that was it was one of those wet years when we were just in a very small tent. John and Ruth were quite young. So this was 92, so Ruth would have been 4, and so it was quite a wet year. And Lydia got the psalm, you know, I'm up to my knees in mud, neck in mud, Lord save me. But that started a relationship with New Wine, and I suppose the whole spiritual stuff. So we came here, we arrived in the August, I was licensed in the September, installed in September. And in your context, that was the year when there were 3 vacancies at the same time in St Albans. And the 3 of us went to each other's inductions. And if you were ordained, you were in the procession. And if you weren't, you were in the congregation. And so there was Brian Moore at St Saviour's, and there was Brian Underwood at Christ Church, and there was me at St Paul's, all put in, and the rural dean was very relieved. So we came here. The church had been in vacancy for just over a year, or just nearly a year. And they were wanting to grow. And I think there was a very loving congregation. My predecessor, Richard Gill, had been there for 26 years and had been very loving. He'd come, I think, to a church which was divided, and he was a lovely pastoral person. He'd done a lot with funerals and people who were older. But the church was probably a bit smaller. I think they'd lost some significant people, but there were new people moving in who were now the stalwarts. So the people like the Browns and the Salisburys had just arrived and were already here, and the Marriotts. So lots of people had come before we came. And it was, I think, open for growth. But it was funny because when we changed things, someone said to me, I wanted change and I wanted growth, but I didn't think it would affect me, and left. And you thought, yep, you can want change in the big scene, but not want it when it impacts on you. And I can remember someone taking me out for lunch to ask me, and they were sort of leader in the church, and struggling with some of the changes. And they were actually a company secretary. And I said to them, look, if your company is making widgets and the factory's really happy, but you're not selling them, your job as company secretary is to tell them this isn't working. Doesn't mean to say the changes you make will work, just means you can't stay as you are. And I felt that was the sort of situation we came into. And of course, I brought us much more experience of the Spirit. And there was some hunger for that. But I'd been on a journey which Richard Gill wasn't in that. And it was interesting, the sort of split, because just before I came here, I think they did an evangelism course with J. John, but left out the practical bit. And Mary Jeffries and Richard were both CMS missionaries. So it had a big mission focus on one level, but we had no live missionaries. There was one son of someone in the congregation who was a doctor in South Africa for a period, but that was the nearest we got to a live missionary. So you sort of felt it needed to grow in those ways. And just by, well, it was God incidents rather than my great planning. About 6 weeks in, I did a questionnaire to the congregation, which at that stage was one Sunday a month was Book of Common Prayer. And there were about 70 people there. And I did a thing about when people become Christians. And when we got to who'd become a Christian in the last 5 years, the answer was no one. And for a church whose motto was witness and worship, that's a fairly sort of salutary experience, as it were. And that led to us going to PCC and say, okay, what helps and hinders change? People, newcomers coming. And we didn't have that long a discussion on it. We wrote those things down. And the next month we came back with the things on the left-hand side as to what helps and hinders, and action on the right-hand side. That led to changing the services.
What were the changes that you made, Tony? Can you take us through those early changes?
The big change was, again, because Richard had been pastoral, the way when you're trying to bring change is you bring a bit of change. So in the Sunday services, one Sunday was very free, all age, where anything went. 2 Sundays were in those days ASB, what would now be Common Worship. And one Sunday was Book of Common Prayer with chanted psalm and as it was in the beginning, as it were. And so it was a very different structure. And it was funny because the week I did it, I was standing at the door. I also went outside the door and greeted everyone as they came in, as well as going to the door at the back. And I found that very useful pastorally. You just sense where people are at, and often then that praying, visiting in the week. But I had a couple come in, and they were a young couple with a child, and I can remember distinctly the man coming in first with a child in the buggy, and then a lady behind with her child holding her hand. And as they got through the door, they were given the black Book of Common Prayer and the red Anglican hymn book. And the man turned to the wife and said, "Wrong week." But they carried on coming in. And you just felt that you cannot have outsiders having to discern which week is the week to come. And actually, the all age was a bit of a complicated formula because it was the last Sunday in the month. So it was either the 4th or the 5th. And so that was one key change. And so with the church warden's help, I identified all the people who would really struggle to lose the BCP. And I went and visited them all. And it was interesting visiting them because I can remember visiting Doris Butlin. And she said to me afterwards, I decided to give the young man his head. So she backed me. And one person said they struggled with it so much they would go to the Abbey for their fix of BCP, but for that week. But basically, I could go around and it helped. I actually like BCP. I don't like chanted psalms, but I do like BCP. And I could say, look, it's not about your spirituality. It's about the need to change, because once you've marinated in BCP for 5 years, you'll probably love it, but people won't come and marinate in it. And therefore, we did that change to the services. We also, already dear Nick and Judy were leading the worship, and there'd been a bit of a revolution in the worship before I came. So that could advance. And Phil George joined us, and he, in the evening, tried to advance things. And I sometimes tried to hang on his coattails. And we tried to do this. How do you bring in change so you don't do it so fast you lose people? But on the other hand, you are keeping going. And Doris Butlin was a wonderful lady, as you can remember probably. She was born and bred in the parish. She had actually gone away, but it was as though she'd never gone away. She was a retired headmistress. Her father had been church warden for yonks and yonks and yonks. And she, I can remember distinctly once, we started coffee after the service. And one of the issues had been finance, and people had to pay for coffee and things like that. And so we did it free. We said, if you're part of the family, you don't charge for people when they come for a meal. And I rang her up and said, could she help with coffee? And she said to me, I don't agree with coffee and church. So I said, oh, I'm awfully sorry, and backtracked. And then on the Monday, she rang me up and said, I think, young man, which always did me good in those days, I think, young man, you're doing something right, because my nephews and nieces don't go to church and you're getting that age group coming to church. So I think you're right. Can I come to Alpha? Because we'd started Alpha by that stage. And when she came to Alpha, my curate Lawrence was doing the Alpha that time. And on the Alpha day, Anne Garside and Leslie Kempsford were in that Alpha cohort. And when the Spirit came, I think one of them rested on the floor and twitched a bit under the Spirit. And Doris was appalled. And she said that this was, she accused Lawrence of being sort of manipulative of young, impressionable people. Well, Anne was a deputy headmistress and not impressionable. And so at the end, she just held on by her fingertips, as it were, stayed for the rest of Alpha. And at the end of it, she said to Leslie and Anne, you will be future stalwarts of St. Paul's. And she was a good judge of character, and she was absolutely right. And then that led on to her in the PCC. She developed into someone who heard God and heard audibly. And that had a really important part in the building project. So you had this process of changing people, keeping people with you so they didn't leave. But I think I felt some of the change was slower than I wanted, but she felt it was breakneck. And it's that sort of balance.
I can see you've described changes in the services. You've described changes in hospitality, if you like, having coffee after services. We've got Alpha being brought in. We've got things of the Spirit more coming into play. Are there other things you particularly want to point out that happened in those earlier years?
I suppose the Spirit stuff, I had one person who said to me, I really think these sort of Spirit songs are like blancmange, and I thought it wasn't worth asking whether he liked blancmange or not, because it's a whole different thing about declarative stuff about God to relationship with God. And I think we were part of a change which New Wine was part of. I grew up with Pathfinders and Cypher and those sort of camps, where I think the principle underneath was that you gave the youngsters a really, really good time, a cracking holiday with games and all sorts of activities. And then in the evening, you did these carefully crafted talks. Now, while that's very good, on one level, it betrays that God isn't terribly interesting. You've got to have the cherry of all the other stuff, and then you slip the gospel in. Very well done and very carefully thought of. New Wine and Soul Survivor started this thing that God himself was interesting. And therefore you spent time in a field worshipping God or learning about God, and and that was the beginning of this sort of center on worship, on presence, God's presence with us, rather than singing songs about him in his presence, singing songs to him. And that is a bit threatening, because intimacy with God is harder to cope with. And it's been, the Jews in the Exodus said, we'll choose distance, you, Moses, tell us what to do. And so the cross, the temple's torn, and you're allowed to go right into the Holy of Holies. And most of us hang back. We're invited to call Abba, God, Father, and most of us call him the sort of formal word of Father, not Daddy. So you sort of have this sinful tendency of both as Christians wanting to come to the life, but clanging back from it. So there was that sort of move. There was also, I think, a people-centric move. So when I got into the ministry, I'd said, God, can I be a vicar? And one of the things he said to me was, you're not expected to do it alone. It's the people with you. So if you don't have all the gifts, actually, that's a good thing, because you need other people's gifts to do stuff. And there are probably people here who feel that I haven't used their gifts, but it was a principle, I suppose, from my heart, not a thought out principle so much, of including people. So the church, when I came, was run on efficiency. So they had a reader for the first week, and then a reader for the second week, and a reader for the third week. So there were 4 readers who read all the lessons. Whereas if you think of everyone playing their part, you then expand the rota and include people. And if you have a view of them helping you with your ministry, you are looking for a guitarist or whatever. If you have the view of helping people develop their ministry, that's both outside the church. So for me, a key element has been Christians in the workplace of work, Christians in the community, you know, Christians doing their own stuff, but maybe, yeah, so people like school governors aren't in the name of the church, but also using their gifts. So if God brings you, you know, 4 drummers, you want to use all 4 rather than not. And Nick and Judy were brilliant at including new musicians, not miking them to start with, and then miking them as they got better. That sort of way of growing family. And I used to visit every newcomer. So everyone who came to church, I used to get their address and go and visit them. And we used to, Lydia and did masses of hospitality. So we had people through the vicarage, and our kids played with them. And so it was done on that basis of relational growth and growing things. And I suppose the other element was prayer. Lydia and I had answers to prayer. When we came here, the roof needed doing. And we discovered the finances weren't in a very good state because they'd redone the curate's house from being fairly, very old fashioned, but there was really no money at all. And we had this roof, which was going to cost 30,000, which now doesn't sound as much, but in those days it was a huge amount. And the church didn't tithe. They had a curious way of giving to mission, that the cash collection, one Sunday a month went to mission, which meant the people who were who weren't giving by standing order gave a quarter, and the people who were giving by standing order didn't give anything. And I felt I should challenge the PCC on tithing. And we did an appeal, and I think it was about 165 people responded to that appeal, which was wonderful. So the church took it on board. We had a day of giving, and we got to 33,000. And dear Philip Havisham said to the PCC, I think we were wrong not to tithe. So we tithed in retrospect, and then later we increased it to 15%. And then I said before, Lydia had set up, as we wanted that money, she'd set up the Monday morning prayer meeting, which ran for years and years. And that was to pray for money, because she knew from her past, from OMF, that God can provide money. And that was quite important, because so many churches would go down fundraising, and we set ourselves to say, this is sweet, to listen to God and to ask God to provide. And then I think I said in an earlier interview, but it was such an amazing moment when in the evening prayer, I picked out this church, there was an envelope in there, and there were only a few people there. And it was a cheque for 30,000. And I beetled straight round to the person. I went home, got the car, went straight round to them and said, I think you filled in the wrong amount, because I was afraid it would drain their account. And they explained this story of this Jewish banker's widow, which they were executor of. And then the heating went wrong and we had to do that. So you saw prayer and action and practicality come together. And God help us to build the church. And then the mission stuff started too. Andrew Leake came to do how much land a hunter-gatherer needs under Avis. And so we developed our first mission link with a real missionary. And again, there was a sort of structural change. They'd done a mission service once a month. And if you do that, you just get the agency person, who often aren't very good. So we changed that process. So when Andrew Leake's around, we use him. But otherwise, he probably wasn't in the country the month his mission was on. And also, once you have a thing like that, when you've got 12 missions, you've no space for more. So it's some of those structural things helped the relational and trying to sense what God was saying and doing, and trying to use the gifts people had and develop it. And we had wonderful, I can think of Stephen Barbie and Robert and Elpida running the youth work and doing wonderful stuff with the kids. So now we've got staff, but in those times we had volunteers. The 3 wise women in the children's group got named because they were so good, and that was Gabby and Anne and Leslie. And in the 90s, we had over 100 children every Sunday. So it was massive then, all run by volunteers. And those volunteers did it every week in a way that was wonderful.
I want to go on to the in probably our next interview to look very specifically at the building project and the things that we've learnt coming out of that, Tony. Just briefly, as we come to this, I'd love to say something about the work you've done with our Muslim neighbours, and indeed with the Jewish folk in St Albans and wider. Is that something that really grew in prominence during your years at St Paul's?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I love, in a way, I love being incarnational. So I loved the parish and wandered around it and visiting people. I love visiting. I think you learn so much from that. And I was just conscious there were 2 mosques in the parish and I didn't know them and I didn't know how to get in touch with them. And I talked with 1 or 2 people, Robert Donald in the council and Ian Lane at the Abbey. And just he got the courage to go and ask about it. This was before 9/11, but in that year. And we went and visited Luton and we set up the organisation, as I say, just before 9/11. And there was a lovely president of the mosque who lived in Brampton Road, who'd been here 38 years and had never spoken to the vicar and never been in the church. And I'd been there by then 8 years. And so we found that we were welcomed and we could go in there, and that started a Muslim-Christian dialogue. And then we added the Jews in. It makes it a bit complicated because Friday, Saturday, Sunday are then all out, because we used to meet on I always feel it's best to do it on their area. If you're trying to grow a relationship, you need to put yourself under them. So it's genuinely joint rather than you doing it to them, as it were. And I felt they'd been put in the freezer. Again, it was interesting. Doris Butlin's father had gone over the road to greet a newcomer who'd come, and that was remembered, and people came to his funeral. And you just think, we had put them in the freezer. So I felt we should do it for the long haul, because it was a long job of building it. And we did later have a survey which said that our community was sort of 2 parallel communities of largely the Muslim and the others. So it worked at that, and it was friendship, it grew friendship. In the early years, we used to invite school heads and things like that to meetings, and it formed a lot of links and opened a lot of doors. Then, as I say, the Jews came in, and the Masort is more than the United Synagogue. And we did do an interfaith thing with the whole gamut of interfaiths with the mayor each year, but it was those 3 sort of Abrahamic faiths we did more with, and it's still ongoing.
And it's as we draw to a close, one of the things that somebody has said to me very recently is that when they talk to our Muslim neighbours, they will all say, "Oh, we know Tony Hurle." So yeah. That's a lovely accolade for you to have. Next time, Tony, we'll be talking about the building project and the years since then. So I look forward to that conversation very much. And thank you for talking to me today.